Welcome one and all to the lesson on the graphs of sine and cosine, where you will learn to state the domain and range of the functions themselves and identify the standard form in all its different components. In order to get started though, we need to review back to the unit circle. Remember that a unit circle is useful because given a degree or common radian, you can find the values for the cosine or sine functions and in turn lead you to find the values of all the other functions. To simplify this, however, we're going to focus primarily on radians themselves. The main focus will be on radians. And as for the values of the functions cosine and sine, we're going to focus on the results that come from the x-axis and the y-axis. So you notice that here for the cosine function, it will start at 1, and then when we get to the 90 degree or the pi over 2, it gives us 0, -1, back to 0, and back to 1. Whereas sine starts at 0, goes up to 1, drops back down to 0, drops to -1, and goes back up to 0. Now to kind of help you visualize what happens if you unravel the circle onto a graph, I'm going to pull up this picture here, where if you start at this line, and this is primarily for the sine function. Notice that when I revolve around the circle, the highest point is 1, drops back down to 0, drops down to -1, and then it revolves back to 0. And then all it does is that it creates this cycle on the wave. So one complete revolution creates one cycle on the sine wave itself. So notice how I just keep doing this and it goes on forever and ever and ever. So in order to get started, we will need to address the standard form of both the sine and cosine. The equations themselves are exactly the same besides the function name. So obviously sine is for sine and cosine is for cosine. And here's the graph that represents both of them at the same time. The one in red is for sine. Notice that it starts at the origin, then it goes up 1, pi, at 0, -1, and back to 0. And notice that the intervals are in pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So it's the same intervals we use from the circle. Now this might change depending on the problem, but that will be for a different time. And then the one for cosine is in green, and notice that it starts up here at 1, but it makes the same motions. So it's just slightly in a different position that you start from compared to sine. Now there are 4 parts to the standard form itself. A is for the amplitude, which is like a height or the mean height of the graph itself. If it's negative, the graph is inverted. We'll get to that in a different video. B is not specifically for the period, but it does affect the period length. We'll talk about that later. And the last one is H and K. These are like your transformations for normal equations. Same idea applies, where the H is the inside value, where positive is left and negative is right. Vertical shifts is dependent on the K outside number. Positive is up, down is negative. And midline is another topic that we'll get to in a separate video. So now to tie it into the basic function of each one, here's the basic sine function where y equals sine x. Now here's the sine function. Now to kind of help you solidify what you should do at the beginning of each problem is identify first, is it sine or cosine? Well, if it's sine, you should always start off at the origin. And this right here is where you start from as 0, 0. And then what it does is that it's going to create this wave where it goes up to 1, drops back down to 0 on the x coordinate of pi, then it drops down to -1 at 3 pi over 2, and then it stops at 1 at 2 pi. So this is a complete cycle between those 5 points. Before we get to domain and range, let's identify what happens if I ask you to find the standard form of a basic function. Well, remember that the basic function is just another word for parent function or original function. The standard form is obviously simplified to look like this, but if you had to write a standard form, just remember that A and B are the numbers in front, which is the 1s, and then H and K are the numbers being added or subtracted, so those have to be 0 in order to not change the value of the problem itself. So A is 1, B is 1, and H and K are both 0. Okay. Now let's talk about the domain range. The domain, remember, it's x values left to right. Well, the thing is, this wave can go on forever in either direction, so it goes forever to the left, and it goes forever to the right, so the domain is all reals. The range is a little bit easier to see because the wave is consistently over and over and over again. The range is from the lowest point to the highest point. What's the minimum value? What's the maximum value? And then the range is everything between it. So, again, if you look at this graph, -1 is the lowest point, and 1 is the highest point. You know that because of the y value itself. The range is the y value. So -1 to 1, and you put brackets in between to represent that it does include those numbers themselves. Now, when we get to future problems where the standard form is not obviously in basic function form and different values affect the graph, the domain will always still be the same. It will still be all reals. The range, however, changes based on, the minimum value and the maximum value. There you go. Now let's get to cosine. Cosine. Notice that this does not start at the origin, but rather it starts at the y value of 1. And then what it does is that when you go to pi over 2, it goes to 0, to -1, back to 0, and 1. So if you really look at it visually speaking, back to sine, it creates the same motions and the same shape. It's just the starting point is different. So make sure you remember that with cosine, you start at the y value of 1 on your y-axis. And then for the sine, you start at the origin. And then here, guess what? The standard form is the same. Same as cosine. The a and b values are both 1 because they're being multiplied, and not to change the value, it has to be 1. And then for the h and k, they both have to be 0. And then even tying with domain and range, same thing. It's the same shape. It's just shifted a little bit differently. But the domain is still all reals because you can hit any x value and you still find a value, still find it on the graph. And the range is again from the lowest point to the highest point, minimum to the maximum. Again, -1 is the lowest point, 1 is the highest one. And there you go. So that covers your lesson on the basic functions of sine and cosine in regards to domain and range and standard form.